Welcome to Career Tools. Today's cast, responding to an internal interview request. Today, Mark and I are going to talk about what to do when you're given an opportunity to interview for an internal job. Here we go. We were talking earlier, and it always amazes me how many people, it's a lot, don't realize that we all manage our own careers now.
You could read that every magazine, every business journal, everything for the last 10 years has been saying that. And yet, frankly, there are some situations, and we're going to talk about one of them today, that confuses people about that, right? I mean, technically, you manage your career. We manage our own careers, but the company or some other company chooses the job, right? They get to say whether or not we get the job. We're not in total control, but we are managing it. The fact is, the company does have some ability to influence our choices in terms of the job we're in and why we're in it and what are the jobs we can have. But when a company asks us to interview, it reminds us, hey, wait, I may be managing my own career, but somebody else has a great deal of influence on it.
Yeah, well, but let's be clear here, though. What we're talking about is that sometimes confusing situation where the company you are working for asks you to interview for a job.
Yeah.
Another job in the company.
Right, without us seeking it or applying for it directly.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, somebody comes to you and says, hey, look, we'd like you to interview for this job. Yeah, and frankly, whether we really want the job or we never would have considered it before, the fact that the company is asking us rather than us going and getting the job ourselves because we're managing our career. If the company seems to know more than we do, and most people feel absolutely that's the case because they probably didn't know the job was open and we don't really know what the invite means, it's confusing to people. Am I managing my career or are they managing my career? And the fact is, we're managing our own careers, but the company obviously has a say because they control what jobs we get.
Exactly. Well, it's for these confusing points precisely that Career Tools exists. So how are we going to explain this one away?
Yeah, this is, after we give away the crown jewels, the rest of it is really good, helpful background. But the first rule is the answer to what should I do when I'm given an opportunity to interview for an internal job? The answer is you always say yes. And we'll talk about all the different reasons why you might say, no, I'm not sure I should say yes. We'll go through all those. But the first answer is you always say yes to any internal interviewing opportunity. That's point number one. Point two, it's important to recognize because interviewing for a job is not the same thing as accepting. We have to get that through our heads because Horstman's law is until you got something, you got nothing. The third point, saying no, for whatever reason people do at the beginning when they're first asked, is a significant limiting step. It means things to the company that you may not mean, and you need to know what those things are so you can reconsider if you're thinking about saying no. Look, if you're not sure what to do, don't say no and get rid of it because step 4 is you can always learn more as you prepare. And then step 5 is, and look, at the end, if you in fact get the offer, whether you want it or not, you don't have to say yes. You can always say no at that point.
Right. At that point, you can always say no. But in the beginning, when you get offered this interviewing opportunity, you always say yes. We always say yes to any chance to interview for any job at any time, literally any job in our entire firm. And there might be a possibility that you're being asked simply as quote unquote competition for someone else. Even if that's the case, you still want to go through the process. And we're going to explain all the details about that here in just a few minutes.
Look, think of it this way. In a dynamic marketplace, your company is out there competing. Things are changing constantly. Something new comes along. Your firm knows nothing about it. You don't know anything about it, but you hear buzz in the marketplace for something. You've never tried it. You don't know what the details are. You don't know what's going on. You don't know what the cost value equation is of this new product or service. You don't know the ramifications of using it or not using it. How is it possible in that situation that a good strategy would be to say no immediately without any more information about that situation? I mean, by definition, that's the most anti-curious, anti-investigative, explorative, anti-fresh idea concept in the world. It is completely the wrong strategy to say no early if you have a chance to say yes without it meaning anything regarding a commitment to almost any situation. At that point, you don't need to decide about the job. You don't need to know anything more than you've been asked. Say yes and sort out the details later.
Okay, so let's say I don't know all the details about the job offer, but at least they've told me what the job title is. I know kind of generally what the job is. So what if I want to go into, I want to go into marketing, and this is a job in information technology, for example. So it's clearly not my first choice. Why would I say yes to that?
Yeah, I love it. You picked the two most diametrically opposed places in the organization, marketing and information technology. Yeah,
just to make it a clear example.
It really doesn't matter at this point. Remember what we're talking about here. How do we respond? What do we say when someone says, I want you to interview for a job? And what we've said is the answer is you always say yes. It really doesn't matter at this point what the job is, because your yes doesn't mean you'll take it or that you're interested in that job more than anything else. If the company is asking, it means something. Now look, if we personally think it's time for a lateral move to broaden our skills, and yet the job we're being offered to interview for is a direct move up, that's okay. Then that means someone thinks it's possible you can do that job above you. And maybe they know something you don't about what you need in your career at that point. Your organization will not let you interview for, be offered, and accept a job that you will fail at. They will not do it. It's too expensive. It is too expensive to do. If the job is a lateral move and you've been burning to finally get to that next promotional level and you're wondering, oh my gosh, they must be sending me a message. All of a sudden in your head, you go, oh no, they know I want a promotion and now they're going to give me a lateral move. This must be a bad sign. I have to say no. I have to prove to them that I want to grow. Wrong. You say yes and you go interview. Maybe this is the firm's way of saying you need more skills first. We'd like you to get promoted, but you're not quite ready yet.
If they're telling you that, and you're not listening to that statement, and you're refusing to go get those additional skills necessary, man, that doesn't sound good.
Yeah, if that's the case, they're trying to give us a shot at getting them, and that's a good thing. And even if the firm wants to think of it this way, if the firm wants your role vacated to free it up for somebody else, and that worries you about your security and your future, interview anyway, because if you don't interview and you don't look for other opportunities, they may give your job to somebody else and then you're out. Interviewing is not accepting the job. It is too soon when you're first offered a possibility of interview to know whether or not you'd say yes or no. You'll probably learn what you need to learn in the coming days and weeks to help you really understand the rationale for why you're interviewing in terms of its effect on your career and future opportunities. And that's going to help you handicap your present role versus the new role. And the more you learn, the better you'll be able to interview and then decide once, in fact, you get the offer. And remember, if you say yes and then you interview well, but somebody else gets the job, how is that a bad thing?
Right.
Right? So.
Good. And I'm a little confused about our next point, frankly, and I'm sure you'll explain this to me. So our next point really is to say yes, even if you think it's a step down. And I don't know about you, dude, but in my experience, when you get a step down, you really don't have to interview for it. It kind of happens.
Yeah. Yeah, your point is exactly right. Look, if you really are taking a true step downward, you're not going to have to interview for it. So therefore, the point of that is when we think we're taking a step down or we're being offered a step down and they're asking us to interview for it, probably what that means is that roles are being revised and that it's not actually a step down. Just because you think it is, if they're asking you to interview, it means it's probably not, because they wouldn't ask you to interview for a role that is in fact a step down. I remember a client I worked with for several years, and they had a couple of restructurings, and the leadership team and I all agreed that really one of their entry-level jobs required a hell of a lot of skills that only someone with more experience would have, even though they were giving it to entry-level people. So this client decided to start putting better people in that role. But the first guy, who had like 8 years of experience with the company, really balked at the idea of interviewing for this other role, this role that was an entry-level job. And he said no to the interview because he knew it was a step down. What actually had to happen, the GM had to intervene and tell him, look, no, dude, you're our first guy of the new vision of what we have for the role, of what it's going to become. We want you over there to show everyone who's already there what they're not doing and how great you can be if, in fact, you have experience in our firm and you're able to leverage existing relationships and so on. And he said, oh, okay, man, if I'm going to look good compared to those guys, good, I will. And in fact, now I think they're done with the transition process. Look, if you think it's a step down and you're interviewing, you're wrong. Go interview. Okay, but even so, whether you're right or wrong, who cares? You need to be ready to interview regularly anyway. Go out and get the practice. And again, you don't have to decide to take the job simply because we're interviewing. So defer your decision. The moment you say no, your decision's made. You'll never have another chance to, hypothetically, you won't have a chance to get that job. Right. But saying yes doesn't mean anything other than I want to think about it some more.
Right. And this is true even if you don't know why you're being asked. I mean, there's a number of possibilities. One, you're a strong candidate. They think you're the best candidate for this position, so they want to ask you. B, you could be a weak candidate.
Right. But you're still a candidate.
But you're still a candidate. Right. And C, one or the other, and you're being looked at through the interviewing process for the firm to gather more information.
Yeah. Look, let me interrupt there real quick because is a situation in the case of interviews that might require some travel, some non-trivial interviewing operational costs. It's unlikely. It's not unheard of, but it is unlikely that you would be a distinctly weak candidate and yet still be asked to interview. But again, it's not impossible. The point is, you may actually have less of a chance than someone else in the process. Okay? There may be a front runner.
Yeah, but that doesn't really matter at all because if they had really made up their mind, if they've truly made up their mind, they wouldn't be interviewing, right? And the offer would have already been made.
Yes, totally. Okay. This is where a lot of less experienced people miss this. Some people would say, but wait, Mike, I've heard managers say, look, it's going to go to Linda. We got to give it to Linda. She's the right person, but we got to appear impartial. So let's make it look good. Yeah, you're right. You heard that. And in fact, the manager meant that. But I can assure you of something that is critically important for you to understand. If you hit a home run in your interview and Linda strikes out, or Linda doesn't prepare well, or Linda acts like it's hers already and tells people it's a Potemkin kind of interview, she won't get the offer and you just might. I promise you, if there's interviewing going on, the decision has not been made. I have seen people throw away opportunities in the interviews or get surprised by how unprepared somebody is. Because if you've known somebody for 10 years, you overlook their faults and you over notice their strengths and you say, oh, she's right for it. Or that's the next step in her promotion or the president likes him. And so we're going to promote him.
Hey, well, look at even we know. And if you listen to Manager Tools, we talk a lot about the stupid things that some managers do. And there are some cases where people have made up their mind. They do the interviewing process to cover their rear end, so to speak. And in this case, they end up giving it to Linda. I've seen it. And I've seen that those interviews take place. They give it to Linda and somebody else who they didn't expect to do so well did really well. And guess what? They start looking for a place they can use that person.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
John he's great. Let's figure something out.
He's way better than we realized. We didn't know he had these skills. I'd never read his resume.
Yeah. I've never met him. Jill, his manager, said he's good, but I've never met him. Man, I interviewed him. He's great.
He's great.
Let's figure something out.
Let's find something else for him. Or what happens if Linda leaves the company because she was already interviewing and that's why they give her this promotion and somebody offers her a bunch more money and so she leaves? The number 2 person through the interviewing process might very well get the job and it might be you. Even though you were there simply as a foil, simply to make it look good, simply to provide Linda a chance to compete and win because she was, quote, the best in advance. None of this happens. None of these opportunities present themselves. None of these chances to make new relationships, to interview so well that you get a check mark by your name and, hey, I'd like that guy to work for me, or I want to pay attention to him more when I'm in meetings with him. None of that happens if you dither or you say no early on in the process. I'm saying again, the answer to that question about whether or not you want to interview for an internal job is always yes. And to be even more clear, it's immediately yes. Look, if you're just there to prep, you aren't really sure whether you want the job. So what? Use the opportunity to get good at interviewing again, because it's one of those Christmas rule skills. You rarely use it, but when you use it, you want it to go well. And again, maybe you learn something about the job afterwards that gets you really excited, that makes you go, man, I was on the fence, but now I know I want that job. Again, how silly would you have looked to have said no and then find out after the interviews that everybody's like, this is the coolest new job. They're revamping it. Wow.
Yeah. Okay. So let me get to the question that is on everybody's mind here, which is, you can't possibly believe and tell our audience here that you could be offered a position after having interviewed and actually say no.
Look, if you couldn't say no, they wouldn't offer you. They'd just make you have the job.
Okay.
I don't know why people don't get that. It's just like in the first step of the feedback model. We ask and we make it a question because we expect to pay attention to the answer. If it's not going to be an offer, and an offer is when control passes from the offerer to the offeree. If it's not going to be an offer, then there's not going to be an interview. You're just going to be placed in the job. So if you're interviewing, it's going to be an offer. And if it's an offer, by definition, it requires you to acquiesce or say yes. And by definition, therefore, say no. It is not a formality. If it was a formality, they wouldn't make you an offer. They would just say, move your office and here's your pay.
Right.
The fact is, when you get an internal change, they're making a decision who it's going to be. And then at that point, once they decide who it's going to be, they have to decide how much to pay you. You don't just come in at, you just don't all of a sudden come in at the bottom of the range. You may come in the middle or the high end of the range. That depends on how you interview and potentially how you negotiate, but we're not going to talk about that here. You totally can turn down an internal offer. You can tell them after the interview you don't want the job because you learned something that's unpalatable. Although I must say, I do remember the case of a guy who turned down a job because, well, he didn't want to say it, but privately he admitted that, look, the guy I would be working for he's one of the darkest guys I've ever known. He's a completely unprofessional, unethical person. And it's okay to say no for that reason, although you have to be very careful about how you would position that one. But little did he know they wanted him to fill the position because they were going to fire this guy and they wanted him to have 6 months of overlap.
Oh, God.
But look, you don't have to make your decision when they ask you, will you interview? That's not the time to make the decision. You're not making a statement which says, if I do well and if I'm best and if I'm offered, I will accept. You're not saying that. You're saying, I'm willing to interview. That's all.
Okay. So what about, I've heard this a number of times when this topic has come up with clients. There are folks that say that their cultures are ones where you're really not supposed to interview unless you really want the job. So there's almost this feeling that you've made a commitment when you accept the interview.
Yeah. I just say, first of all, you know this too, because you've seen it. Of the places we've been, most professionals who tell us that have a vastly overstated sense of what the company's culture actually is. It's just not so in the vast majority of places we've been. It's not. Now, we're not saying that your boss isn't telling you, look, don't go interviewing somewhere where you have no interest. That's a waste. In a sense, she's right to say that to you. She has an obligation to be frugal about time and cost. There's no problem with that. But when you're asked, hopefully we've shown you that you don't know enough to know whether or not you have a legitimate interest or not. And the fact that the company, other people who are smarter than you, look, if they're 2 levels below you, they're not the people making the decision. These are people above you in the hierarchy who are making the decision. It's reasonable to assume that on average, people a couple of levels above you know more about what career positions are available, what career positions are good, what skills are required, and what might help you in your career. as well as what'll help the company. They don't want to put you in a job you're going to fail in. So look, the company has an obligation to be frugal, but you don't know enough to say no. Maybe it is working for a terrible boss, somebody you would never work for, as I mentioned earlier. But again, he may be getting promoted or fired for that matter. We don't know that in the beginning. And that statement regarding the culture is overrated. And if you feel that's the culture, say yes, and then spend a lot of time learning what you need to know before you go into the interview. And then you may be able to graciously bow out at that point, but I still probably wouldn't recommend that. Maybe in 1 out of 50 situations would I recommend that.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, though, that saying no at this point, that's a pretty significant limiting step. I mean, saying no here is a big statement.
Yeah. Yeah. They know all the reasons why they asked us, but we don't, at least not at that first moment. Saying no says this to your company. It doesn't matter to me what additional information you might share with me. I'm categorically opposed to whatever you're suggesting. And look, if it's not obvious, that kind of reflexiveness is not professional. It's not impressive. That kind of certitude is really a form of rigidity, I think. And that's dangerous among managers. You know, what we'd be saying is, I don't care what you want and how much you might know about the future that maybe you can't share with me, because I know what I want and it's so different from what you want from me. I don't care to hear what you want from me.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess if you're okay saying that, go ahead, but we advise reconsidering. And let me say one more thing about it's a limiting step. If you get asked 3 times in most large organizations, the general rule is 3 times, and you turn down company offered opportunities, you will be sending a message, whether you intend to or not, that you're not interested in further development, and you will not be asked again for other opportunities, period.
Yeah. It's not a good career management tactic, I wouldn't say.
Yeah.
Well, the cool thing about this is, let's assume we say yes. Even though you don't know a lot of information about the job, you're going to learn a heck of a lot more as you prep for the thing.
Yeah. This is what the always yes answer really gets us. It buys us time. We learn more about the details, the situation, the strategy. Maybe you learn enough to be turned off, even though you might still go interview anyway, learn what the interviewers are like, meet new people, get a sense of what the boss over there is actually like. And again, then decide more information. Those of you who are high C's will love it. Ready, aim. You'll love it. Talk to friends, talk to mentors, talk to bosses, talk to HR, talk to peers who have interviewed for other similar jobs over there. Piece together the puzzle as you're going through the process. Don't guess at the puzzle, get it wrong, and say no, and then regret it later when the puzzle looks very different than what you thought.
Right. Yeah. Like you said, you may find negative things, but you may find a lot of great things as well. You may find you're working for a boss who's you just know is going to be a great mentor to you. You may get exposed to different parts of the company that you haven't had exposure to before. You may broaden your network and therefore have even additional opportunities beyond that job. I mean, there's all sorts of benefits that you won't know unless you take the time to go through the process.
Right.
And the great thing about it is it really doesn't matter, because in the end, you're going to have a lot more information and you can always say, no, I don't want the job.
Yeah. No company wants you in a job that you don't want to be in. Say no if you go through the process and you discover it's not a match. Now, look, there's a couple more casts here about what to do and how to do that. It's not trivial. But our point here, our fundamental point, is not when you should say no. The point is the one time you should not say no is right at the beginning. That's a strategic error, because you'll have plenty more chances to say no if you need to. Saying no isn't wrong. Saying no immediately is professionally immature, and that never helps your career. Wait, say yes, decide later.
Good.
That's it.
Well, that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Quick wrap up. Always say yes, whether you think the job is your first choice or not. Even if you think it's a step down, it's probably not if you're interviewing. And even if you don't know why you're being asked, don't worry. Have a little trust. Interviewing is not accepting. Saying no means something significant, probably more than you mean it to. Be careful about it early on. You can always learn more as you prep to help you decide whether you're excited or not. And again, at the end, you can always say no. That's it.
Excellent. All right, my friend.
Thanks, partner.
Thank you. We'll see you. Thanks, everyone. That's it. If you're in the process of looking for a job or looking for other career advice, please join us on the website, www.manager-tools.com. All right, folks. See you next week. So long.